Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekhachari Wagh, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today we are going to discuss the module titled Land Reforms Legislation, a Sociological Assessment 2. This module is part of the paper Agrarian Social Structure and Change that is coordinated by Dr. Manish Thakur of IIM Kolkata. In this module, we are going to look into the sociological assessment of land reforms. While doing the sociological assessment, we are going to look into the implications for rural society and agrarian structure. Especially, we will focus on how land reforms have differential success of land reform legislations in different regions and states of the country. Further, we will look into the whole idea of how land reforms has not to be understood only in terms of its economic impact, but also its sociological impact. At the end, we will engage with the idea of land question. Land reforms legislations or sociological assessment 2. As recounted in an earlier module, land reforms were conceived as a program that would usher in positive economic change along with social justice in the lives of the cultivators in the rural, poor and independent India. This in turn would create a social base for a democratic system of governance. India was said to contain the largest number of rural, poor and landless households in the world. To the extent that landlessness was an index of the extent of rural poverty, redistributed land reforms were therefore considered as a measure with immense possibilities. Land ceiling laws were first enacted in 1950s and 1960s. These were revised after national guidance were issued in 1972. Though India passed a large number of land legislations directed towards improving the plight of the rural poor, the experience of land reforms has been mixed. According to Government of India statistics, by the end of 2002, 12.4 million tenants on 15.6 million acres of land had benefited either by having ownership rights conferred upon them or by having their rights protected. This comprises 8% of India's rural households and about 4% of India's cultivated land. It is no doubt that the law allowed the tenants to acquire ownership or owner-like rights to agricultural land, but the same law led to the eviction of a much larger number of tenants. The benefits were realized soon after the implementation of the Act, but what it curtailed was the prospect of future tenancies, which limited the livelihood options of the poor as well as the landowners alike. Let us now assess the land reform policies in the light of changes that has brought about in the lives of the rural poor and the agrarian power structure at large. Impact of land reforms and assessment. Ensuring redistribution of land. Agricultural land ceiling acts and laws are one of the best known efforts of land reform initiated in India. All Indian states adopted legislations that place ceilings on the amount of land that a person or a family can own. The objective was that excess land beyond the specified ceiling would be distributed to the landless, marginal and the poor. Ceiling laws were enacted and enforced in two phases, one between 1960-72 when no specific policy prescriptions or guidelines were present, two from 1972 and after the adoption of national guidelines. According to an estimate as of 2002, the state governments have redistributed approximately 5.4 million acres of land to 5.6 million households. West Bengal amounts for 20% of that redistributed land and 47% of the ceiling surplus beneficiaries. According to an estimate, the state governments have allocated 14.7 million acres of government wasteland to poor rural households through land reform. Further, it was found that the ceiling legislation also prevented the concentration of land ownership. The NSS data on land holding show that over time the share of land in the largest size class has declined, but this could be due to the demographic pressure of partitioning family land. Land reforms and reduction of poverty. It is said that poverty and literacy are both connected to land reforms. DN cites an econometric study of India's experience from 1955 to 1988 that claims that there has been a robust evidence of a link between poverty reduction and two kinds of land reform, namely tenancy reform and abolition of intermediaries. Another important finding is that land reform can also benefit the landlords by raising the agricultural wages. Although the effects on poverty are likely to have been greater if a large-scale redistribution of land has been achieved, the results suggest that even a partial reforms which mainly affect production relations in agriculture can play a significant role in reducing rural poverty. Another study by Partha Sarathi and Murthy also claims that land reform enables an advancement of literacy. Despite limited land reform, a comparison of neighboring states like West Bengal and Bihar or Kerala and Tamil Nadu points out that superior literacy status is achieved in states where land reforms are implemented successfully. In this manner, land reforms and literacy are also connected to each other. Land reforms were particularly successful in certain states like West Bengal and Kerala, where the communist governments took initiative to frame as well as implement the law in such a manner that it benefited the landers. Operation Barga. This was the second phase of land reform undertaken in the state of West Bengal in the late 70s and early 80s when the left-front government was in power. Although about 30 acres of land had been vested of the state following the first phase of land reforms, large tracts of agricultural land way beyond the ceiling level were still under the control of the landed gentry held through devious means. A massive quasi-judicial process was held to unearth such land, and in 3 years about 1 million acres of agricultural land vested in the state. Operation Barga was started by the left government in 1977 with an intention to give attention to the sharecroppers and tenants who had been evicted by the landlords as they had testified in the quasi-judicial process. The methodology of this program was innovative, whereby revenue officials went to the field to verify the actual sharecroppers in the presence of landowners and recorded their names. This was a reversal of a 100-year-old process. Between 1978-81, 1.2 million sharecroppers' names have been listed. In quantitative terms, over 1.6 million sharecroppers were recorded, giving them hereditary right of cultivation and a fair deal in crop sharing with a certificate of sharecropping which could be used as a document to establish one's identity and also for securing crop loans from institutions. About 1 million acres of vested land were distributed among 2.5 million beneficiaries who were landless on land-poor peasants. 500,000 households were given titles to homestead plots. Land reforms thus directly benefited over 4 million rural households, which was a significant proportion of the rural population. West Bengal's land allocation practices emphasize distributing available land to as many landless families as possible rather than trying to give each beneficiary family a full-size farm. In recent years, the state has been allocating the dwindling supply of ceiling surplus land in very small plots, averaging less than 1/3 of an acre. Field studies have shown that even a fraction of an acre can provide important supplementary benefits to a landless family. Apart from intensively farming the plots, there were reportedly significant increases in food consumption, income, and social status attributable to the plots. In other states, the disappointing results were largely due to a lack of political will. In many cases, ceiling legislation was incomplete and allowed large landowners to avoid the law. The laws also failed to provide fair compensation to landowners. Thus, even after policymakers revised the law, government officials lacking the will to make compulsory land purchases from the relatively powerful landowning class. The lack of adequate land records also make redistribution efforts more difficult. Though there is a need for land reform, still the lack of political will exists even today. In Kerala, Land Reforms Act 1969, which gave ownership rights to the cultivating tenants and homestead rights to the hutman dwellers, is considered as a model in the implementation of land reforms. Land reforms is said to have played a very important role in materializing some of the positive development achievements of Kerala, including higher levels of literacy and lower birth and death rates. But in the recent years, studies have shown that land reforms in Kerala have failed to provide adequate land to the actual tillers of the soil. The failures in the implementation of measures such as exclusion of plantations from the ambit of land reforms and non-implementation of the Ceiling Act are pointed out as reasons for the unsuccessful outcomes of land reforms. Baskaria claims that there is low linear relation between land reforms and land relations in the state today. Her study shows that the scheduled castes, who are the actual tillers of soil, still stand at the bottom even today vis-a-vis ownership of land. In fact, multiple factors like fragmentation and uneconomic land holdings, larger processes of commercialization, outmigration from the region, and the impact of social reforms and demographic pressures on land mediate agrarian social relations in the state. Despite its potential and reach, the general assessment of land reforms in the Indian context is rather negative. For example, the report of the Task Force on Agrarian Relations of the Planning Commission of India said in their overall assessment of land reforms, the programs of land reform adopted since independence have failed to bring about the required changes in the agrarian structure. The lack of political will of the state governments is said to be responsible for this failure. This is amply demonstrated by the large gaps between policy and legislations and between law and its implementation. It is alleged that in no sphere of public activity in our country since independence has the hiatus between the precept and the practice given policy, pronouncements and actual execution has been as great as in the domain of land reforms. After 1947, the Congress government had the delicate task of balancing the expectations of substantial tenants against the existing power and political connections of the old landlord classes in different regions. This was not easily achieved. The Uttar Pradesh Zamindari Abolition Act of 1952 and the imposition of Ceiling on Land Holdings Act of 1960 pruned the old landlord class, though many families were able to preserve wealth and land through various strategies. The land reforms in UP, for which Charan Singh took credit, broke up many of the old estates. Some of the landlord families lacked the skills and connections in the law and administration to match the new rulers. Large employers of substantial tenant farmer families became outright owners and employees of the landless agricultural workers. In UP, wealthy tenants became substantial landowners, but the actual tillers of the soil, landless laborers, found no change to their position. Their position may have worsened in that now that the people they worked for are more secure, confident and powerful than ever before. In the sense that landlords were dispossessed, land reform in Uttar Pradesh could be declared accomplished. However, if land reform meant a wider distribution of holdings, little happened. In fact, national sample surveys showed that the bottom 40% of the rural households in Uttar Pradesh holding 2.5% of land in 1954 and 2.9% in 1982. In Bihar, though there was a lot of public enthusiasm created for land reforms and concomitant agrarian change, legal tangles and political obstacles stood in the way of deep changes in the land ownership patterns. In fact, the Land Reforms Commission reported in 2008 that almost 75% of the rural population in Bihar was landless or near landless. While the achievement cannot be discounted for those benefited, significant negative impacts experienced by a far larger group offset positive results. Mass eviction of tenants. Tenancy reform caused large-scale eviction of tenants. One study estimates that tenant families were ejected from as much as 33% of India's agricultural land due to tenancy reform legislation. Though the Land Reforms Act was framed in late 1950s, it was implemented in different parts of the country not before 1965. During this period, landlords got ample opportunity to take care of their interests. A large number of tenants were evicted on the pretext of resumption for self-cultivation. It was widely held that success in tenancy reforms was possible in an area where tenants were better organized and powerful. But in many cases, it had been seen that the very process of land reforms has led the landlords and joint family landlords to effect large-scale evictions of tenants from land. Therefore, in such cases, tenurial reforms led to decrease in the security of tenure. In his assessment of impact of Land Reforms Act in Mysore, C.B. Damle alleged that by the time the radical tenancy legislation was tabled in the State Legislative Assembly for enactment in 1974, nearly 78% of the tenants had already lost their occupancy rights because of their evictions, mostly on the flimsy ground of resumption for self-cultivation. Ami Basu also cites how land ceiling in a number of villages led to the numbers of joint family to divide the land in smaller proprietary units, causing both fragmentation and mass eviction of peasants. In addition to causing eviction, tenancy laws caused passive dispossession of the poor. These laws prevented the poor farmers from accessing land through tenancy. Most rural households believe that landowners risk losing some rights to the land when they rented it out. As a result, some landlords choose not to farm their land rather than to lease it out for the fear of losing rights and to control to tenants. When land is rented, it is given only to people the landowner can trust, not to assert rights. For extra protection, the landowner also rotates the tenants to different parcels, often every year. In a country which is largely agricultural, when land is a source of income and social status, poor households do not fear exploitation as much as they fear not being able to access land to improve their lives. The landless poor households often report that they wish more land was available for land. Failure in land consolidation. Due to differences in the quality of land holdings, land consolidation reform was not as effective. Land consolidation is aimed as a process which brings together bits and pieces of land owned by a person but strewn around in different places together such that it facilitates cultivation and boosts productivity. But in the course of distribution of land, it was found that land consolidation became a difficult fact because richer farmers used their power to obtain better quality land holdings. Despite the widely introduced legislations in 16 states, land consolidation program was unsuccessful in all except 3 states of Punjab, Haryana and Uttar Pradesh to some extent. Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Karnataka made little achievement. Factors like heterogeneous land quality affected land consolidation. This was of course not a problem in the states like Punjab, Haryana, where land quality was not uneven. In other states, farmers did not want to lose any fertile piece of land because they were not sure about the quality of land to be allocated to them. Land consolidation also suffered because of the resistance of landowners, interpersonal disputes, weak land administration and such reasons. Other factors like lack of scientific land records, especially in the states in the eastern region, corrupt bureaucracy, legal loopholes and lack of technical skill on the part of officials were other causes of failure of land consolidation. Further, small farmers and tenants feared that they would ultimately be evicted and become jobless due to the farm mechanization facilitated by land consolidation. As the tenancy rights were not legal rights, the tenants were also concerned about the security of the rights because they thought that land consolidation may be a pretext for their eviction by landlords. Farmers were also hesitant to change the existing arrangements due to their strong sentimental attachment to land parcels. Proletarianization. Studies on agrarian processes in contemporary India showed that land reforms were most successful in the subsistence-based paddy cultivation areas rather than the areas with commercial plantation. Interestingly, even where land reforms were successful, it was said that most of the beneficiaries were among the upper and middle caste rather than the lower Dalit caste. However, it was found that land reforms were unable to improve the economic status of the beneficiaries much. Although ex-tenants became landowners and landless laborers got small homestead plots, a large part of the land were unviable for cultivation. In fact, according to estimate in Dakshin Kannada region, about 86% of the land distributed to the middle caste were fragmented and untenable. They had to look for alternative sources of income and sometimes they even joined the large forces of agricultural laborers in the region. This was solely an impact of land reforms. The region saw an increase in the number of agricultural workers who are largely casual laborers. Many ex-tenants also got evicted, also joined the rank of agricultural laborers. This trend is known as proletarianization of labor. Impact on agrarian structure. Land reforms were envisaged as a measure that would lead to both economic development and social justice. These were thought of as an initiative that would help in overcoming the stagnation in agriculture by creating an interest in it. The crux of the land problem was that land was concentrated in the hands of the few who were neither interested in cultivating nor managing it. Alongside large masses of peasants who were actually tillers of land were dissociated from it. The fundamental aspect of land reform was to remove this discrepancy, which would in turn increase productivity, address social justice and lead to economic development. But it did not turn out the way it was envisaged. Although land reform was a program with radical intent and its ideology was one of the anti-landlordism oriented towards the general interest of the peasants, it was found that actual program of land reform ended up serving the interest of the peasant proprietors rather than of the rural poor. According to P.C. Joshi, the intermediate classes made a joint front with the rural poor to oppose the feudal burdens imposed by the landlord class. But then it made common cause with the landlords in order to oppose any interpretation of land reform which might mean redistribution of land in the favor of rural poor. Although there was a perception of a crisis of the agrarian system and a widespread peasant discontent on the eve of independence, this feeling was skillfully exploited by the political elites to wrest the maximum benefit for the intermediate classes from the old landed interest rather than from the rural poor. P.C. Joshi mentions that the context of agrarian reform program was such that they did not seek to attack the land concentration but only to modify it, that they sought to extend protection not to all classes of tenants but to a certain specified sections belonging to upper strata of the peasantry. Thus, the land reforms in the long run led to the emergence of new landed classes consisting primarily of medium landowners and superior tenants, who would henceforth exercise direct control over the economic system and wield enormous political power from the village to the top levels of power structure. Thus, land reforms did not make any significant difference to the people at the bottom of the agrarian structure or the actual tillers of land. The intermediate classes or classes of superior tenants were the ones who benefited. Land reforms and the exclusion of women. Historically, land reform has excluded women. A transfer of property rights to the landless and land poor is said to have increased the bargaining power of the tenants in the wage market. But studies on Andhra Pradesh point out that this was not so the case of women agricultural laborers, whose families got wasteland as a part of land redistribution. They did not share in the improved bargaining position. The responsibility of women for household maintenance, diversion of men's incomes into liquor and other channels of personal consumption left women with lower wages than men and forced women to accept various onerous conditions of work that men refused to accept. This shows that it is not enough to increase the bargaining power of men only. The realization is that specific attention needs to be paid towards increasing the bargaining power of women as agricultural laborers by allotting them individual land rights as well. Women's ownership of land is necessary to stimulate the labor and investment. In case of rural male outmigration, ownership of land by women becomes a necessity for acquiring credit and necessary flexibility in the management of farm resources. Thus, land reforms in India have had a mixed record. They have been envisaged as a tool through which the state would directly intervene to improve the conditions of large masses of rural impoverished poor who had very low bargaining power in society. The initial phase of land reforms in the early 60s was left to the states, but the initial enthusiasm for land reforms abated because India faced a massive food crisis in the decade of the 1960s, and the state's attention had to be directed towards productivity enhancing measures like Green Revolution. The rising tide of rural unrest in form of nationalism in different states forced the government to think of land reforms again, and national guidelines were formulated in 1972 regarding reducing land ceilings, introducing family-based ceiling on land, tenancy reform and other such similar measures. Almost a decade later, a review undertaken as part of the 6th five-year plan found that land reforms had failed to achieve its goal due to lack of political will of the state. In fact, P.S. Appu, a long-time observer of land reforms, opinions that the successful abolition of intermediary interest is against a near-complete failure of land tenancy reform and land ceiling legislation, and redistribution of ceiling surplus land has been largely a reflection of the class behavior and democratic political structure of the post-colonial Indian state and state power. The 7th five-year plan from 1985 to 1990 reiterated land reform to be the core of anti-poverty program of the state and integrated it with mainstream rural development activity. But with globalization and in the ushering of the neoliberal reforms, land reforms have become a forgotten agenda of state policy. Market-based land reforms were introduced with key financial and technical support of the international agencies and banks, which ultimately did not benefit the poor as they were made unable to access land. The rural sector in India today is marked by simmering unrest due to land acquisition policies of the government which favors the industry. While we witness a gradual shift towards land markets, India is still left with the persistence of a land question. Friends, in this module on land reforms and sociological assessment of land reforms, we have looked into the various contexts of sociological understanding of land reforms in India. What is important for us to understand is that if we have to look into land reforms in India, first we have to look into the context of market reforms. The experience of market reforms followed by the Indian government and policy has really led to a differential experiences of land reforms in different parts of India. Second, we also need to understand that in today's neoliberal time, there is a forgotten agenda of land reforms. In recent times, the government is not focusing on land reforms, but rather looking at individual solutions to poverty. Finally, we also have to understand that failure of land reforms is due to lack of political will of many political leaders in the country.